At first glance, a program for string orchestra alone might seem that it would lack the variety and the colors that one would expect from a full symphony orchestra. And while that may be true, it's also true that there is great potential for a world of exciting sounds and colors from just the string orchestra alone. The instruments are homogeneous. Right? We have the violin and the viola, a slightly larger version of that same design. Cello, even larger version. The bass, the largest version of those. They're all similar in design, and they create a consort, or a family of instruments. But that family is capable of far more than just what we think of as the standard approaches to making sound. They're also capable of fantastic textures that are achievable only through instruments that are similar in design and sound. So the program is brought together by those instruments at its core. We enhance that orchestra with two other plucked string instruments, the harp, which is plucked with the fingers, and the harpsichord, which is mechanically plucked. Now, these two instruments will broaden further the sound possibilities and the world that we're going to encounter in this program. The program is brought together on the theme of history and folklore. History because it spans a long compositional history. We're looking at almost 300, possibly more years that the music embraces. It's also looking at folklore. We're looking at cultural traditions, not only of the classical symphony orchestra, but reaching outside of the classical tradition. And these possibilities that we get by bringing things together from different cultures across that history. Historically, of course, we go from a work that dates to the early 18th century, and in fact, one of the first great works for the string orchestra as we know it today, and all the way up to a piece that was written within our lifetimes. One could argue that it's essentially hot off the presses, written within the last 20 years. And within that array of compositions and the music, we're going to encounter so much variety, styles of approach to composition, the ways we approach the instruments, the way they work in combination with each other. We get a variety of tone colors, textures, and compositional approaches. So by the time we finish the program, we've gone on an extraordinary journey through a panorama of sonic worlds. Of the 6 Brandenburg Concerti, number 3 is the only one that scored for the standard string orchestra as we know it today, comprised of violins, violas, cellos, and basses. It also adds the addition of a harpsichord, and I'll describe more about that in a moment. But this string orchestra, the consort of string instruments, is treated in a virtuosic fashion in this work. Now, these Brandenburg Concerti are all virtuosic works. They were composed at a time when Bach was working as a Kapellmeister in Köthen, Germany. And during his time in Köthen, he was writing for instrumentalists who were available, a number of works, primarily instrumental music, a little bit less vocal music than he had before. And he was looking to get another job. And he was approached by Christian Ludwig, who was the Margrave of Brandenburg, and said, "Send me some of your work." And Bach sent some examples of his work, including these 6 pieces that were really masterpieces for instrumental music. And he sent them, in fact, he didn't get the job, but the fact that they were sent to Brandenburg in consideration for the job, the name has stuck. Now, the term concerto, of course, suggests that there are soloists. And typically when we think of a concerto today, we think of an orchestra that has one soloist in front of it, or possibly 2 or 3, but they're separate instruments from the orchestra. But these Brandenburg Concerti, the soloists are actually the orchestra itself. It's essentially a concerto for everyone. There are 3 violin soloists, 3 viola solo parts, 3 cello solo parts, and so everyone is playing a line that is soloistic. Sometimes the instruments play together. The violins all play together on a line. Sometimes the violas play all together. But sometimes they are broken down even further, where the first violin, the second violin, and the third violin will be playing separate parts. This all leads to the way Brandenburg 3 creates tension and drama in the music. So the drama is created, first of all, by the fact that it is motivically driven. It's driven by the same motive throughout, especially in that first movement. The first sound we hear, ta-ta-tum, the rest of the music is constantly driven by that motive. Motive meaning the smallest repeated building block of a composition. So once that motive is spelled forth, everything is permeated by that. And as the music may wander off and it starts to spin away from that motive, members of the group come in and remind us that it's there. If we get away from it, suddenly we'll be reminded, da-da-dum, it drives the music. Listen to the way that that motive is constantly presented from the beginning. From the moment Brandenburg 3 begins, it's as if it's in perpetual motion. We don't have spots where the group stops. We don't have large rests. The texture sometimes thins, but essentially it's driving at the same tempo all the way through the first movement. And then there's a very curious thing. The second movement is just one measure with 2 chords. That's all Bach left for us. How do we approach that? Well, some choose to have it as just 2 simple, sweet and simple chords. We play those, we pause, and then the drama continues as it moves into the last movement, which once again is perpetually in motion and fast, virtuosic, always going. But it also opens up possibilities. How do we handle that second movement? Some treat it as a spot for improvisation. Open it up. Perhaps the harpsichord player will play a solo. Perhaps the violinist will improvise something. Bach leaves that up to the performers. And as to what's going to happen on this program, I'll leave it to you. We'll find out when we hear the concert. How do they approach those 2 chords in the second movement? One other thing worth noting is the harpsichord part. Bach doesn't score the harpsichord part for both hands. In fact, all the harpsichord player has is the bass line. It's part of what we call the basso group that includes the basses and celli most of the time. And yet, the harpsichord you're going to note is going to be playing with both hands. So our harpsichordist for this program, Gregory Hand, is going to be improvising with his right hand. He's going to be playing that left hand on the bass line, but you're going to hear things all the way through. The harpsichord often functions in this music as a percussion instrument. It clarifies the downbeats by playing chords, and it gives the music a sense of weight at the beginning that's lifted off as we move across the measures. But as you watch and listen to the concert, keep in mind that all the way through, that right hand, that's coming off the top of his head. It's not music that Bach wrote for him. At first glance, the harp is a seemingly very simple instrument. It's just a series of strings of varying lengths with pins on either end to hold them in place. And for hundreds of years, this design worked perfectly well. But as composers started exploring music with more chromaticism, or notes that were outside of just a simple scale, the need to have the harp able to switch keys and play different notes between the notes of a simple scale became more and more pressing. So in the early 19th century, one of the great innovations was the development of the pedal harp, where we have all the standard strings of the instrument, and below there are 7 pedals that, by pressing them down or releasing them upward, each string can then move a half step up or a half step down. And that allowed the instrument to be played chromatically and play all the different keys, but it also requires a new type of virtuosity with the feet. So there were still efforts to come up with other designs, and at the end of that century came a design for what they referred to as a chromatic harp. It's a harp that had crisscrossing strings and 1 string for each note. And the Parisian company Pleyel, who were building these instruments, decided to promote them by commissioning a work for this instrument and string orchestra by composer Claude Debussy. And while after that, the chromatic harp sort of faded into obscurity due to a number of issues, including the fact that tuning so many strings can be a real headache, and the fact that the instrument has a perhaps different sonorous quality that's a bit buzzier than the pedal harp. Debussy's music lives on as one of the most popular pieces for the harp and orchestra. When listening to this work, notice the shifting role of the harp between being a foreground melodic instrument and an instrument that accompanies the string orchestra. Add to this the fact that the harp, like a piano, is capable of accompanying itself. We have an instrument that is shifting seamlessly between all these roles and different textures throughout the music. Also note that because the pedal harp won in its rivalry with the chromatic harp, we have the pleasure of observing perhaps the only standard orchestral instrument that requires not only dexterous fingers, but also virtuosic footwork. Composer Gabriela Linafranc is one of the big stars on the American composition scene today. She describes her music as being born of a combination of cultural influences, especially those of her family, where she explains how her mother comes from Peruvian and Chinese background, and her father's ancestry is Lithuanian and Jewish. And she views her mix of cultural influences as a driving force in her art. Now, this composition that we're going to hear on the program tonight, Leyendas, or Legends, is looking at an Andean walkabout, right? It's rooted in the musical traditions, the folkloric traditions of Andean music. And she uses the term mestizaje as something that is a combination, mix of cultures where one is not subjugated by another. That is a mixture of the Western classical tradition and the Peruvian folkloric tradition. And throughout this music, you're going to hear sounds coming from the string orchestra that are created to be reminiscent of, or in fact quite similar to, the sounds that we would hear from Andean folk instruments. These instruments include various forms of the flute, such as the toyo, the tarka, zampoña, and the quena, which some are pan flutes and some are end-blown flutes. Also, relatives of the guitar, such as the charango, which is a small, even more metallic-sounding miniature guitar instrument. And through clever combinations of the orchestral instruments, we're drawn into the sonic world and space of the Andean folk instruments. So, for example, at the beginning of the first movement, toyos. The toyo is a pan flute with very long tubes, and when the player plays on the low end of this instrument, it's almost more percussion than it is pitch. We hear this sharp attack with a hollow, vibrating sound afterwards. And to achieve this sound through the orchestral instruments, she calls on the violins and cellos to play sul panticello pizzicato, that is, plucking the instrument with the finger very close to the bridge of the instrument, giving it a more metallic sound and a sharper attack. At the same time, the violas are called on to play flautando, which is a light flute-like bow stroke, and at the same time they're playing sul tasto over the fingerboard of the instrument to give it an even softer color and with a very wide vibrato. And so this combination of all these sounds simultaneously, we get that percussive effect of the toyo flute as well as the vibrating and hollow sound that echoes after that. And throughout the other movements, Frank likewise uses the orchestral instruments to capture the sound of Andean folk instruments. When we get to the final movement, Coqueteos, we have this fantastic experience where she is trying to capture the sound of what she describes as these gallant men who sing flirtatious songs, the romanceros. And the romanceros are singing harmony accompanied by guitar. And to capture this sound, she begins by having the violins play in harmony like the romanceros. And in fact, in the score, she marks it romanceros under the line. And against that, we have other instruments that are either playing strummed or playing with tremolo, this very quick alternation of the bow back and forth to get a buzzing sound, to capture the sound of a wild guitar. But at the very climax of the movement, these are all put together, and the line of the romanceros is playing in harmony, singing this very flamboyant song, and against this, she has tremolos all over back and forth with the other instruments, and she describes this as her vendaval de guitarras, or a storm of guitars. In addition to his contributions as a composer, we also owe Béla Bartók a great debt of gratitude for his efforts to preserve and share the folk music of Central Europe. In fact, Bartók is often referred to as the founder of ethnomusicology, in some cases even the father of ethnomusicology, for his efforts to transcribe and record music in rural populations around his native Hungary and surrounding regions. And through that work, he not only was serving an important academic contribution, but also he was informing his own work as a composer. And perhaps the most famous example of this is his Romanian folk dances. The Romanian folk dances were songs that he collected during his studies in Transylvania, which at the time was part of Hungary, and he originally called them his Romanian folk dances from Hungary. But in 1920, after Transylvania became part of Romania, he just simply titled it Romanian Folk Dances. And these dances were composed originally for piano alone in 1915, and then in 1917, he created another version for orchestra, including strings and a few winds and a pair of horns. And since then, there have been numerous adaptations, including for string orchestra alone and violin and piano and other versions of it. It's a very popular work. Like Gabriela Lina Frank's references to the Andean folk traditions, Bartók also uses the standard orchestral strings to capture the sounds of Romani folk traditions. So, for example, to capture the sounds of fiddles or folk flutes, he uses elaborate lines and ornamentation with seemingly improvised gestures to capture the sound of, for example, someone improvising on a flute. The music is earthy, it's wild, it's comical, it's contemplative, it's mysterious. All of this, 7 dances in all, in the span of about 6.5 minutes. Now they're all performed attacca, and at the beginning you can tell when one dance moves into the next by the styles that are somewhat contrasting. But when we get into the last 3, it's just a mad dash to the end. Astor Piazzolla is credited with revolutionizing the traditional tango and leading toward the development of what we call Nuevo Tango. And the Nuevo Tango is it's rooted in the tango tradition, but employs even more elements of jazz and the classical tradition. Piazzolla was a bandoneon virtuoso. It's a button instrument like an accordion or a concertina. And he was also a remarkably prolific composer, composing over 750 works in a variety of genres, including opera and theater music, film music, of course tango, and other classical works. This shouldn't surprise us that he was also doing a lot of classical work in addition to his tango work. He did study with Alberto Ginastera, the great Argentinian composer of classical music, and even went to Paris and studied with Nadia Boulanger, the great teacher of so many important musicians of the 20th century. While studying with Boulanger, she apparently wasn't so impressed by his work as a classical composer until she heard his tango, and then she realized just what amazing skills and ideas he had. His tangos become very popular, especially after his death in 1992, and it's quite common to find them on programs by classical artists, soloists, and ensembles. Oblivion was composed for the 1982 Italian film Enrico IV, or Henry IV. It's a film based on a play about a nobleman who knocks himself out, and when he comes to, he believes that he is the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And so the title Oblivion captures some of the narrative of the story, dealing with someone who is oblivious or unaware of their surroundings. But it also captures the feel and mood of the music itself. While Piazzolla is best known as a composer of tangos, Oblivion is actually a milonga. Milonga is a relative of the tango, perhaps an even older dance form, and it's traditionally associated as being a happier or faster dance. And in this case, the milonga, though, is not a faster, happier dance. It's actually more timeless. Yes, it has that constant pulse of the dance that drives it forward, the milonga rhythm. But over this, there's a melody that lingers, and then it slides quickly to another note, and then it lingers there. And this continues throughout the music, and it allows us to really meditate on a single sound. The result is a magnificent musical tension between stasis and motion that forces us to also consider the beauty and the emotional possibilities of a single tone. Finally, I want to encourage everyone to look at the printed program notes by Richard Roda. These provide an even more in-depth examination of the historical context for each of the works on the program. And with that, I invite everyone to enjoy the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra's journey through history and folklore.